They think kindness looks like control. Pretend you're confused. We'll get a discount, my daughter whispered, her smile tight, her eyes darting toward the waiter as if I were some secret embarrassment she needed to disguise as pity. I remember the exact shade of the tablecloth, a pale cream that smelled faintly of bleach and citrus. I remember the flicker of the candle between us and the way her voice lowered to a rehearsed softness, the kind she used when she wanted something from people. "Just act a little off," she murmured. "It makes them more generous." The waiter had just walked away to fetch menus, and I sat there, my palms pressed to the edge of the table, wondering when exactly I had become a performance piece in my own daughter's show. I'm 81 years old. I still live alone, though everyone tells me I shouldn't. The small apartment smells of books and lemon polish, and I keep my late husband's jacket folded over the arm of the chair like a relic of a saner world. My daughter, Ellen, visits twice a month, always in a rush, always with the same perfumed anxiety of someone ticking off an obligation. When she called that morning to say, "Let's have lunch, my treat," I almost said no, but then I thought of the silence of my kitchen, the single cup on the drying rack, and I said yes. The restaurant was one of those bright modern places that tries too hard to look effortless. White walls, hanging ferns, music that never settles on a melody. Ellen arrived in a fitted coat, carrying her phone like a second heartbeat. "You look great," she said, which is what she says when she doesn't mean it. Her husband, Richard, followed behind, tapping at his smartwatch, and their daughter, Lily, 16, and permanently bent over her screen, didn't even look up to greet me. I told myself not to mind. Teenagers are like passing storms, loud, unfeeling, and gone before you finish bracing for them. But the whisper came before the water glasses did. "Pretend you're confused." It wasn't a joke. Her tone was brisk, managerial, like she was briefing a colleague. She leaned forward as she spoke, her perfume sharp enough to taste, and I could see the faint twitch of calculation in her mouth. "Sometimes they offer a senior discount if they think you're struggling," she said. "Just misread something, maybe forget your order. It helps." I wanted to laugh, but something inside me locked. It wasn't the words. It was the casualness of them, the ease with which she assigned me a role, as if my dignity were an accessory she could remove for a better price. I felt the ground shift in that small, invisible way that announces the start of humiliation, the first fracture before the collapse. The manager was nearby, a young man with too much confidence and too little empathy. He was training a new server, speaking in the deliberate tone of someone who believes authority is charm. I noticed his head tilt slightly, the way a person leans toward gossip when Ellen gave her little instruction. Maybe he thought he misheard. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I felt the air change. When the menus arrived, Ellen took mine before I could open it. "Let me help you," she said brightly, as though reading a bedtime story to a child. "The print's tiny." I told her I could manage. She ignored me. "You'll like the soup," she said, glancing at the waiter. "She forgets sometimes, bless her heart." I watched him nod sympathetically, and in that moment I understood how easily a lie becomes a record. One line on his notepad, one polite smile, and suddenly I was someone who forgets sometimes. I wanted to walk out. I wanted to tell the manager, the waiter, everyone in that room that I was not a problem to be explained away. But I stayed, out of habit maybe, out of the years I'd spent being the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed every edge in a family full of roughness. I folded my napkin carefully, aligning the corners, because I needed something, anything, to still be precise. The food came. Ellen chatted about property values, Richard scrolled through emails, and Lily filmed her plate for some online story. I sat quietly, sipping soup I hadn't ordered, tasting nothing but the faint salt of humiliation. Every few minutes, Ellen would touch my arm and say, "You okay, Mom?" Loud enough for nearby tables to hear, her tone syrupy, almost heroic. I wanted to ask her who she was performing for. Not me, not the waiter. Perhaps herself. Perhaps the idea of being a good daughter in public, the kind who takes her poor, forgetful mother out for lunch. Halfway through the meal, the manager came over. His smile was managerial, trained. "Everything all right here?" he asked, but his eyes lingered on me. I nodded. "Delicious," I said. My voice was steady, but Ellen jumped in. "She gets mixed up sometimes," she said too quickly. "We're just glad she's eating out again." The manager's smile tightened, and something flickered behind his gaze. Discomfort, suspicion, maybe pity. "Of course," he said slowly. "It's good to see families caring for their elders." The words landed like a benediction and a warning all at once. Caring for their elders. As though I were a fragile heirloom, they dusted off for display. I looked at Ellen, and she smiled, pleased with herself, convinced she'd done something clever. The irony was almost beautiful in its cruelty. I had worked 43 years as a librarian. I'd read every line of the city budget when I petitioned for better lighting in the children's section. I'd balanced our family finances through 2 recessions, but now, because my daughter whispered one sentence, I was reduced to a discount. The check came with a 10% deduction marked senior courtesy. Ellen beamed. "See, it worked," she said, slipping her card to the waiter. I felt something inside me harden, something that had been soft for too long. On the ride home, the silence between us was padded with her triumph. She talked about errands, about how nice it was to see me out, how sweet the staff had been. I stared out the window at the passing storefronts, each reflection slicing my face into fragments. When she dropped me off, she leaned over and kissed my cheek. "You should thank me," she said lightly. "People can be so kind when you give them a story." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sentence, hearing it over and over, until it became a kind of haunting rhythm. Pretend you're confused. Pretend. Pretend. I wondered if this was how erasure begins, not with violence, but with suggestion, with a whisper that reshapes the truth until even you start to question it. I made tea, the way I used to for my husband when he couldn't sleep, and sat by the window watching the glow of the streetlights. Somewhere below, a cat knocked over a trash can, the sound sharp and alive. I envied it, that small rebellion, that clatter that said I exist. The city moved on, indifferent, but I stayed there, holding the cup in both hands, determined not to let the night take my memory of who I was. The next morning, a letter came from the Department of Social Services, stamped with urgent red ink. Adult Protective Services, initial inquiry. My breath caught. We received an anonymous report of potential neglect or exploitation, it said. I read it twice before sitting down. The restaurant manager, I realized. He'd overheard. He thought he was saving me. I laughed then, quietly, not out of humor but disbelief. My daughter's lie had become the world's truth, and now strangers would come to verify whether I was safe. I looked around my small apartment, the shelves of alphabetized novels, the framed photos of students from years past, the order of a life built on competence, and I felt something unfamiliar rising inside me. It wasn't fear. It was fury, clean and steady. That's how the story began. Not with an argument, not with a betrayal shouted across a room, but with a whisper disguised as love, a discount dressed as care. I used to think aging was a slow fading, but that day I learned it can also be a theft. The theft of perception, the quiet rewriting of who you are. And as I sat there, letter trembling slightly in my hands, I promised myself one thing, that if the world wanted to mistake me for confused, I'd let them, but only long enough to see how sharp clarity can cut when it's been underestimated for too long. I didn't call Ellen right away. I read the letter from Adult Protective Services 3 times before I placed it on the table beside my cold tea, each line heavier than the last. It wasn't an accusation, not exactly. It was written in that bland, bureaucratic language meant to sound gentle while still rearranging your life. They wanted to schedule a visit to ensure my safety and cognitive well-being. There was a form to fill out, a consent line, a box to check if I required assistance with daily living. It was the first time I had ever been asked, in writing, whether I was capable of being myself. I sat there, surrounded by proof of my competence, the neat bills filed by month, the calendar marked with doctor's appointments, the groceries I'd arranged alphabetically in the pantry. And yet the letter made it all seem like a stage set, a performance of normality that no longer convinced the audience. When I finally called Ellen, her voice was sharp, impatient, the sound of someone juggling too many tasks and refusing to admit that one of them mattered. "Oh, that? Don't worry, Mom," she said, almost laughing. "They probably just follow up on anyone who looks a little frail in public." I told her it wasn't in public, that it was specific, that someone had named me, my address, my circumstances. There was a pause then, the kind of pause that reveals guilt long before the words arrive. "Well," she said carefully, "maybe it's for the best. At least they'll see you're okay. It'll make everyone feel better." I wanted to ask who everyone was. I wanted to ask how she could be so calm when the government had just questioned my autonomy. But I didn't. I thanked her, because old habits die the hardest, and gratitude is the one women of my generation were trained to offer, even when they were being dismantled. That night, I laid out my records on the dining table like an exhibit: bank statements, medical receipts, library membership cards, the electric bill with my signature written in firm cursive. Proof of life, I thought, absurdly. Proof of clarity. I wrote a note to myself on a yellow pad. "Remember, you know who you are." The next morning, I called the number on the letter. The woman who answered was young, polite, her voice full of that professional sympathy that already assumes fragility. Her name was Nicole. She told me she'd be stopping by just to chat, nothing formal. "We just want to make sure you're safe, Ms. Harper." I told her I'd be waiting, that the kettle would be on, that I liked people who did their jobs thoroughly. She laughed, not sure if I was joking. When she arrived, she looked exactly as I expected: efficient haircut, tablet in hand, shoes that didn't make noise. She complimented the apartment, the smell of cinnamon tea, the way the light came through the curtains. She asked about my medications, my finances, my family. I answered each question slowly, clearly, the way I used to teach children to read. When she asked if I ever got confused about dates or names, I told her I'd been the one to remember her appointment, not the other way around. She smiled, typing notes I couldn't see. I watched her eyes move across the room, taking inventory of my sanity, the orderly bookshelf, the tidy kitchen counter, the framed photo of Ellen holding baby Lily, the absence of chaos. She didn't expect order. She expected evidence of decline, something she could report, something that would make her visit necessary. At one point she said, Your daughter seems very attentive. I looked up from my teacup and asked, Does she? She nodded, scanning her screen. She mentioned she helps with your finances, that she's been worried about your memory lately. I felt my throat tighten, a slow, creeping heat rising from chest to jaw. Is that what she said? I asked. Nicole nodded again, still typing. For a moment I couldn't speak. There was a peculiar, hollow ringing in my ears, the sound of betrayal finding its way through blood. My daughter hasn't paid one of my bills in 20 years, I said finally. She couldn't even tell you the color of my checkbook. Nicole's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Well, she said softly, sometimes family members misinterpret things. It's our job to clarify. I realized then that clarity was exactly what frightened Ellen, because when I was clear, I remembered things she wanted forgotten, the mortgage I helped her secure, the tuition I paid when she lost her job, the promises she'd made to repay what she never did. Confusion was safer for her. It erased the ledger of obligation. I saw it now, the strategy disguised as care. After Nicole left, I sat in the quiet, the air heavy with her polite scent of office perfume and procedural pity. I felt stripped, like someone had walked through my mind with a clipboard, ticking boxes labeled capable, vulnerable, delusional. I wanted to call Ellen again, to demand an explanation, but I knew how that conversation would go. She'd sound wounded, defensive, righteous. She'd say, I'm just trying to help. And maybe, in her own distorted way, she believed that. The next day, I received an email confirmation. No immediate concerns. Case closed. The phrase was meant to reassure, but instead it sat in my stomach like a cold stone. No immediate concerns, as if my life were a temporary reprieve, a condition to be revisited when it worsened. I thought of Nicole's careful questions, her probing eyes, the weight of Ellen's convenient fiction hanging between us. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt watched. 2 days later, Ellen called again. See, she said cheerfully, all sorted. I told you it was nothing. I told her I'd appreciate it if she didn't mention my memory again, to anyone, anywhere. She sighed, that long exhale she uses when she wants to sound patient. Mom, you're taking it too personally. It was just a misunderstanding. I asked her if she'd told the restaurant staff I was confused. Another pause. Well, she said, you were a bit flustered that day. You didn't even notice when the manager asked how your soup was. Because you were talking over me, I said quietly. I noticed everything. Her tone shifted then, from condescension to irritation. You always do this, she snapped. You twist things. You make it sound like we're villains when all we're trying to do is help you. I let her speak until the words ran out. Then I said, if help means turning me into someone I'm not, you can keep it. She hung up without saying goodbye. That evening, I walked to the restaurant alone. It was drizzling, the kind of soft, forgiving rain that makes the world look clean even when it isn't. The same waiter was there, the same manager. I ordered tea and asked for the bill before they could ask about family. When I finished, I left a note on the receipt. Thank you for caring enough to report me. I am safe, and I am not confused. But the person who told you I was, she is. I didn't sign it. On the walk home, I felt something close to calm. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in tenderness, in the language of protection. My daughter's lie had been small, almost laughable, a discount, a moment of theater, but its consequences had multiplied, like a spark finding dry wood. She had opened a door she couldn't close, and through it came the cold machinery of a system built to decide who is still real and who is ready to disappear. When I reached my building, I stood in the lobby for a long moment, watching the elevator doors slide open and shut, like a slow, mechanical breath. I thought about what it meant to be believed, how fragile that privilege is once someone decides you shouldn't have it. One whisper, one signature, one well-intentioned inspection, and suddenly you're the unreliable narrator of your own life. I went upstairs, poured a glass of water, and sat at my desk. The letter from Adult Protective Services lay folded beside the lamp. I took a pen and wrote across the top, Exhibit A, the day I was redefined. Then I began a journal, not for sentiment, but for record. I documented the date, the words she used, the time of the visit, every expression that passed between us. If this was the start of a story in which I would be recast, I wanted at least to be the one who kept the script straight. Outside, the rain turned steady, tapping against the glass like a soft insistence. I listened, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small. I felt present. I felt awake. And in that stillness, beneath the bureaucratic language and the maternal betrayal, I made a quiet promise to myself. If they wanted proof of my mind, they would have it, word by word, line by line, until there was no room left for doubt. I began keeping the notebook on the kitchen table, open beside the sugar bowl, as if it were an ordinary thing, not a record of something disintegrating beneath the calm surface of my life. Every morning I wrote the date, the temperature, a list of things I'd done, small acts meant to tether me to proof, the laundry folded by 10, the call to the pharmacy, the bus schedule memorized, the meal planned without confusion. It was tedious, almost absurd, but there was comfort in its precision. The world had tried to put me in parentheses, and I refused to fit. The social worker's visit should have ended it, but instead it began the quiet tightening of distance between my daughter and me, a subtle choreography of omission and avoidance that spread through every call, every carefully worded text. Ellen started forwarding me articles about memory wellness. She'd mention new supplements, invite me to join online workshops about aging gracefully, as though the problem were not her betrayal, but my refusal to play the part she'd assigned me. When I didn't reply quickly enough, she'd leave voicemails that began too sweetly and ended too sharply. You really shouldn't live alone, Mom. It's not safe. You forget how quickly things can go wrong. The first time she said it, I laughed. The second time, I realized it wasn't a suggestion. It was a campaign. One afternoon, she appeared at my door without calling. I opened it to find her standing there, arms folded, carrying that brisk scent of office air conditioning and self-righteousness. I was in the area, she said, stepping inside before I could respond. She looked around, inspecting the space as if expecting to find evidence of decline. Dishes unwashed, a light left on, a confusion she could point to. But everything was as it always was, neat, quiet, balanced. She smiled tightly, as though the order itself annoyed her. Still keeping everything alphabetized? She asked. Old habits, I said, the kind that keep the world from falling apart. She sat at the table, eyeing the notebook. You're still writing things down, she said. Good. It helps. I closed it gently. It's not therapy, Ellen. It's documentation. She frowned. Documentation of what? I looked at her, long enough for the silence to answer. She changed the subject, of course. She always does when the air grows honest. We had tea, though she didn't drink hers. She told me Lily had applied to colleges, that Richard was working late again, that the world was busy and demanding, and that I should understand. I listened politely, but my mind drifted to the way she glanced at her phone between sentences, as if timing how long decency required her to stay. When she finally stood, she leaned down, kissed my hair, and said, "Try to rest more, okay? You sound tired lately." It was not concern. It was strategy. Fatigue makes people pliable. A week later, I received a call from my bank. A polite man asked if I wanted to confirm the new cosigner added to my account. My breath caught mid-answer. "What cosigner?" I asked. There was a pause, the sound of keyboard clicks. "It appears your daughter contacted us to discuss options for managing your funds." I thanked him, hung up, and sat perfectly still for several minutes, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. That sound, the steady, indifferent continuation of the world, became unbearable. I called Ellen. She didn't pick up. I called again. When she finally answered, her tone was airy. "Oh, that. It's nothing, Mom. I just wanted to make sure your bills were handled if, anything happened." "If anything happened," I repeated slowly. "I'm not dead yet, Ellen." She sighed. "You're overreacting. The manager at the bank said it's common for older clients. It's safer this way." I told her to remove her name. She said she would, though I could hear the flatness that meant she wouldn't. That night, I took every document, every receipt, and placed them in a new envelope marked private. I hid it behind the loose panel beneath the sink, the same spot where I used to keep spare keys when Ellen was a child. Funny how safety reverses itself over time. The calls became more frequent. "Did you take your medicine? Did you pay the utility bill? Do you remember your neighbor's name?" Always small questions, harmless on their own, corrosive in accumulation. I began to hear the echo of the restaurant in her tone, that same manufactured concern that masks contempt. "Pretend you're confused." The phrase returned to me in quiet hours, as if it had never really ended. One morning, I caught sight of her car idling outside the building. She wasn't visiting. She was watching. I stood by the curtain, unseen, and watched her watching me, the engine running, her face half lit by the glow of her phone. After 10 minutes, she drove off. I wrote the time in my notebook. Evidence. Proof. Later that week, a letter arrived from a local senior residence. A glossy brochure slipped out. Soft focus images of smiling retirees holding hands, slogans about peace of mind and care without compromise. No signature, but the envelope bore Ellen's handwriting. I placed it in the drawer with the rest of the paper trail. The pile was growing. Letters, notes, bank statements, voicemails transcribed by hand. Each one was a small brick in the invisible wall she was building around me. The following Sunday, she invited me to brunch, a peace offering, she said. We met at a cafe near the river, the kind of place that sells nostalgia by the cup. She ordered for me without asking. "The usual," she told the waiter, though I'd never been there before. I waited until he left, then said quietly, "You contacted the bank." She didn't even flinch. "Of course I did. I worry about you." "You worry about control," I said. Her smile thinned. "Mom, this paranoia isn't helping anyone." The word stung more than I expected. Paranoia. It's a word designed to erase. I sat back, letting the noise of the cafe fill the space between us. The hiss of the espresso machine, the hum of conversation, the clatter of cups. "You think because people believe you, it makes you right," I said finally. "But belief isn't truth. It's convenience." She looked away then, pretending to check her phone, the same gesture she used when she was a teenager caught lying about homework. Some habits, too, never die. When the food came, I couldn't eat. The smell of it, rich and foreign, turned my stomach. I asked for the check, but she waved her card. smiling at the waiter as if to say, "See how good I am?" On the receipt, she scribbled something, probably a thank you, probably a performance. I wondered how many small stages she built in her life, how many roles she rehearsed until they replaced her sincerity. That afternoon, I walked by the river, past the benches where the older couples fed pigeons, past the water glinting with sunlight that looked almost false. I thought about how quietly control disguises itself as love, how easy it is for those who claim to protect you to steal the language of care. I used to think cruelty was loud, but it isn't. It's quiet, administrative, patient. It's a daughter calling the bank just in case. It's a form sent in your name. It's a manager reporting you because someone whispered you were confused. By evening, I had made my decision. I found a lawyer's number in the phone book, an old man's habit, still trusting paper, and called. I told him I needed to establish a private trust and to block any future access from relatives. He didn't ask for details. He'd heard it before, I could tell. "It's more common than you think," he said gently. "Family doesn't always mean safe." His words settled into me like stones in still water, heavy but stabilizing. That night I sat by the window again, the city murmuring beneath me, and opened the notebook to a fresh page. I wrote, "The danger is not confusion. The danger is the story others tell when you stop defending yourself." Then I closed it, poured myself a small glass of wine, and let the room go quiet. I could feel the next step forming, the subtle shift from defense to defiance. Something was coming. I didn't yet know what, but I could feel it gathering like a storm you can sense long before you hear the thunder. It was on a Wednesday morning, gray and undecided, when I realized that silence had stopped protecting me. I had been writing in the notebook for weeks by then, pages filled with dates, phone calls, times Ellen had shown up unannounced or sent letters addressed not to me, but to the estate of Margaret Harper, as if she were rehearsing for my absence. I had filled the spaces between those records with fragments of memory, lines from old poems, recipes I hadn't cooked in years, anything that reminded me that I still remembered. But that morning, as I stood in the kitchen with my pen poised over the page, I felt a strange pulse of defiance, a need not only to document, but to act. The air in the apartment felt heavy with the accumulation of waiting, and I thought quite clearly that I was done being someone who merely endured. I began by taking inventory of what still belonged to me. Not the objects. I'd never been sentimental about things, but the traces of autonomy left scattered through my life. I had my accounts, still under my name alone, the modest pension from the library, the spare keys to the building that I'd hidden under the radiator years ago. I had the phone number of the lawyer I'd called, written on a slip of paper tucked into the front of my notebook. I had, most importantly, my will, handwritten long ago after my husband's death, folded into a file marked private. I took it out and read it carefully, line by line, as if decoding a message from a former self. The language was dry and practical, but the intention beneath it burned quietly. I wanted to leave my life in order, and I wanted no one, not even my daughter, to own the narrative of my decline. That day, I walked downtown, past the post office and the courthouse, until I reached the library where I had worked for most of my adult life. It had been renovated since my retirement, glass doors instead of wood, self-checkout machines replacing the familiar desk. But the smell inside was still the same, that faint mixture of dust, paper, and possibility. The new librarian, a young man in his 30s, recognized my name from the old staff roster and greeted me with a nervous kind of reverence. "You're Mrs. Harper," he said. "I've read your training manuals." I smiled, surprised that anything I'd written still mattered. I asked if I could use the archives room for a while. He handed me a key card without hesitation. In that quiet room, surrounded by the ghosts of catalogs and ledgers, I began to gather evidence, not of crime, but of continuity. I printed my pension statements, requested certified copies of my identification, notarized a statement declaring that I was of sound mind. It was tedious work, bureaucratic and slow, but it grounded me. The printer hummed, the paper slid warm into my hands, and I felt the steadiness of purpose returning. I was not merely defending my sanity, I was reclaiming my authorship. When I left the library, the air outside was bright with late afternoon sun, and I felt lighter, almost giddy. I stopped by a bakery and bought a small loaf of rye bread and a slice of lemon cake. The woman at the counter, a stranger, called me dear without condescension, and that simple kindness nearly undid me. I walked home slowly, the bag warm in my hands, the city unfolding around me with its small proofs of life, a child laughing, a cyclist cursing at traffic, a dog barking at pigeons. It all felt new, as if I'd stepped out of a fog I hadn't known I was in. When I got home, there was another message from Ellen. "Call me," it said. "It's important." I didn't. Instead, I made tea, sliced the cake, and sat at my table watching the late light fade across the floor. I thought about the years I'd spent smoothing over other people's discomfort, making myself smaller so they could feel large and benevolent. I thought about the word help, how it had been weaponized, how easily it became a leash. That night, I wrote a letter, not to Ellen, but to myself. You are still here. You are not a patient, a case, a burden. You are the witness of your own life. I folded it and slipped it between the pages of the notebook like a promise. The next morning, I made an appointment with the lawyer. His office was in a narrow brick building that smelled faintly of dust and old carpet, and his secretary, a woman with silver hair and a brisk voice, led me to a room lined with filing cabinets. Mr. Carver was older than I expected, his tie slightly crooked, his hands spotted with age. "You mentioned a trust," he said as I sat down. "Tell me what you need." I told him everything, not the family drama in detail, but the outline, the erosion of trust, the quiet encroachments. He didn't look surprised. "You'd be astonished how often this happens," he said. "Children start managing their parents' lives long before they need managing. It starts with good intentions and ends with power of attorney." I nodded, feeling both sick and vindicated. He helped me draft new documents that ensured no changes could be made to my finances without my explicit consent. As I signed each page, the ink pooling slightly beneath my pen, I felt the ground of my life firming beneath me again. On my way home, I stopped at a small park and sat on a bench under the shade of an elm tree. The wind moved through the leaves with a sound like pages turning, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. I realized that clarity doesn't always come with rage. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet acceptance that no one is coming to save you, and that this, in itself, is freedom. Later that evening, I found the courage to open my old photo boxes, the ones I had kept sealed since my husband's death. There was Ellen as a child, her face round and open, her hand clutching mine in a field of wildflowers. I stared at the photograph for a long time, tracing the edge of her small smile. I remembered how fiercely I had loved her, how I had worked double shifts to afford her dance lessons, how I'd once driven through a snowstorm to bring her a forgotten project to school. Somewhere between then and now, something had shifted. perhaps in both of us, and I wondered if all betrayal begins not with cruelty, but with fear. Maybe she was afraid of my decline before I ever showed signs of it. Maybe she wanted to manage me so she wouldn't have to face her own aging reflected in my body. That realization didn't forgive her, but it softened the edges of my anger into something more precise, something closer to understanding. Still, I knew softness was dangerous. Pity, even for the one who wrongs you, is a kind of surrender. So I took the photograph and placed it back in the box, not to forget, but to keep memory where it belonged, in the past. I made a new habit then. Every morning, after writing in my notebook, I would take a short walk to the park, sit on that same bench, and read from a book of poems I'd borrowed from the library. It was a way of practicing presence, of reminding myself that I was still capable of learning new rhythms, new ways of existing. A week later, I noticed that the calls had stopped. No messages, no unexpected visits. At first, the quiet felt suspicious, like the calm before an intrusion, but gradually it began to feel like space to think, to breathe, to listen to my own thoughts without someone narrating them for me. I started cooking again, small meals that filled the apartment with familiar smells: lentil stew, apple crisp, roasted vegetables. I caught myself humming while washing dishes, a sound so strange in its lightness that it startled me. The weight of months had begun to lift, not because anything had been fixed, but because I had stopped waiting for permission to feel whole. One morning, as I returned from the park, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me in the hallway. "You seem brighter these days," she said kindly. "Whatever you're doing, keep at it." I thanked her, and as I closed my door, I smiled at the simplicity of that validation. To be seen as ordinary again, not as fragile or fading, was its own kind of triumph. That night, I sat at my desk and reviewed the documents Mr. Carver had mailed back to me. Everything was official now, sealed and notarized. I placed them carefully in a folder and slid it into the drawer beneath the notebook. The act felt ceremonial, like planting a flag in reclaimed territory. For the first time in a long while, I slept through the night without waking. In the morning, sunlight spread across the kitchen floor in long, clear lines, and I found myself smiling without reason. I poured coffee, opened the window, and listened to the birds outside. It occurred to me that the great act of rebellion at my age wasn't dramatic at all. It was simply refusing to disappear. I didn't know what Ellen would do next, or if the calm would hold, but I knew that whatever storm came, I would meet it standing upright, notebook in hand, ready to record not just the damage, but the endurance. It began quietly, as all second storms do, with the stillness that pretends to be peace. For several weeks after I established the trust and filed the legal papers, there had been a strange calm around me, a kind of polite truce that felt too deliberate to last. The phone calls from Ellen stopped entirely, and for a time I almost believed she had accepted defeat. The apartment felt lighter without her voice threading through it, but underneath the calm, there was a tension, a vibration that hummed like a wire pulled too tight. I sensed that she was regrouping, collecting new ways to reach me, and I was right. It was a Saturday morning in early spring when the next message arrived, not from her, but from my building manager, a young man named Victor who was too kind for the job. He stood at my door holding an envelope, his face uncertain, the way people look when they have been asked to deliver trouble but don't yet know the shape of it. "It was slid under the office door last night," he said. "Thought it looked personal." The envelope bore no return address, only my name typed neatly in capital letters. Inside were printed screenshots, emails, apparently from my account, messages I had never written, each one requesting withdrawals and authorizations, each one addressed to Ellen. At the bottom of the last page, in small bold text, was a note. "We are monitoring for fraudulent activity. Please confirm your identity immediately." I felt my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with recognition. I understood this kind of maneuver. It was control through confusion, the digital version of the whisper in the restaurant. I called the bank, and after a long wait filled with instrumental music that felt like mockery, a representative explained that there had been conflicting communications. Someone claiming to be my assistant had attempted to change the primary contact information on the account. I gave them the new security password I had set with Mr. Carver, confirmed my voice print, and locked everything down again. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long while, the weight of what had just happened pressing slowly against me. I should have been angry, but what I felt was something closer to grief. I realized that Ellen was no longer simply careless or controlling. She was desperate, and desperation always escalates. That afternoon, I decided to confront her directly. I didn't call. I took the bus to her neighborhood, the same cul-de-sac where every house looked like a mirror held up to its twin. When she opened the door, surprise flashed across her face before she smoothed it into something resembling concern. "Mom, you should have told me you were coming," she said. I stepped past her into the foyer, ignoring the faint scent of citrus cleaner that always clung to her house. "I got an envelope," I said, "and a call from the bank." Her mouth tightened. "You shouldn't worry about that. It's being handled." "By whom?" I asked. "By me," she replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The conversation that followed unfolded like a play we had rehearsed too many times. She accused me of paranoia, of misunderstanding. I accused her of interference. The words were long, brittle, and useless, clattering against each other without finding meaning. When I finally turned to leave, she called after me, her voice sharp and unfamiliar. "You can't live like this forever, Mom. People are starting to talk. You need help." I didn't look back. I just said, "They've been talking my whole life. It's the only thing people ever do consistently." That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the apartment felt heavier, as if her presence had followed me back, lingering in the corners like smoke. I brewed tea, but even that ritual failed to calm me. I opened the notebook and began to write, not in neat lines as before, but in long, breathless sentences that spilled over each other, recording every detail of our encounter, every flicker of her expression. It was part memory, part testimony. When I finished, I added a single line at the bottom of the page. "If she wants war, I will give her truth." Days passed. Then came the visit from Adult Protective Services again, this time unannounced. The knock at the door was firm, official, the kind that rearranges your heartbeat before you even know why. It was a different worker, a man in his 40s with a weary kindness about him. "Routine follow-up," he said, flashing his badge. I invited him in, though my hands were trembling slightly. He asked questions I had already answered months ago about my medications, my daily routines, whether I had someone to check on me. I handed him the folder I had prepared with copies of every legal document, every receipt, every letter. He leafed through them with a kind of hesitant respect, nodding slowly. "You're very organized," he said. "That tends to make people suspicious," I replied. He smiled faintly, not sure if it was a joke. Before he left, he said something that lodged itself in my mind. "Sometimes family gets scared when they see their parents getting older. They try to help the only way they know how. I wanted to tell him that fear doesn't excuse invasion, that love isn't love when it's built on the assumption of your incompetence, but I didn't. He wouldn't have understood. After he left, I sat by the window watching the street below. The world went on, as it always does, indifferent to private wars. I began to think about escape, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, practical one. I could move, sell the apartment, start somewhere smaller, where Ellen wouldn't find me easily. Portland had taught me years ago that reinvention is always possible, even in the last chapters of life. I started researching small towns along the coast, places where the rent was low and the libraries still smelled like paper. It wasn't running away, it was preservation. But before I could act, the next blow landed. One morning, my neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, knocked on my door holding her phone, her face pale with concern. "Maggie," she said, "I don't want to alarm you, but there's an article about you." I frowned, took the phone, and there it was, an online feature from a local human interest column. When aging parents refuse help, one daughter's struggle to protect her mother. My name wasn't mentioned, but the details were unmistakable. Librarian, widowed, lives alone in the city, possible cognitive decline. The quotes were anonymous, but I knew her phrasing, her rehearsed compassion. "She doesn't always remember conversations," one line read. "It's heartbreaking to watch someone you love fade." Fade. The word hollowed me out. That night I printed the article, highlighted the relevant passages, and placed it in the folder with the rest. The record was growing thicker, heavier, undeniable. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Strangers began to treat me differently. The pharmacist spoke slower when I picked up my prescription. The grocer offered to carry my bag, though it was barely 5 pounds. Even Victor from the building started calling twice before coming upstairs, as if worried I might not recognize his voice. I had become a story, a parable of decline told by someone else, and the world was happy to believe it. I refused to let it end that way. I contacted a friend from the library, Nora, a woman I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had always trusted facts over gossip. When she answered, her voice cracked with surprise and joy. We met the next day at a cafe near the university. I told her everything, carefully, without bitterness. She listened, her brow furrowed deeper with each detail. "You need documentation," she said at last. "Not just notes, official verification, psychological evaluation, medical report, whatever shuts them up." It was harsh advice, but sound. Within a week, she'd arranged an appointment with a neuropsychologist she trusted. I went, endured the tests, the endless pattern drawings, and memory recitations, the questions designed to measure your lucidity by how well you conform to a checklist. When the report came back, it was unambiguous. Cognitive function intact, no evidence of impairment. I read the line 3 times, then tucked it into the folder, proof of mind, in black ink. A week later, Ellen called again. Her voice trembled, just slightly, beneath its usual authority. "I heard you've been spreading stories," she said. "People are calling me, asking what's going on." I almost laughed. "Stories?" I asked. "I thought that was your specialty." "This is getting out of hand," she snapped. "You're turning people against me." "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself when you mistook control for care." There was a long silence, and then she said something that chilled me more than anything before. "If you won't let me help, I'll find someone who will." The line went dead. 2 days later, I received another letter, this time from a law firm I didn't recognize, citing a petition for conservatorship. She had filed it. My own daughter was trying to have me declared legally incompetent. I sat in the kitchen with the letter in my hands, the words swimming before my eyes, and for a moment I felt the air leave the room. Then, slowly, steadily, I began to breathe again. I thought of all the pages I had written, all the documents I had saved, all the small, deliberate acts of preservation I had performed. She believed she had cornered me, but she had only built the case I would use against her. I called Mr. Carver, sent him scans of everything, and he assured me we would respond. "It will take time," he said, "but the truth is on your side." In the days that followed, I moved like someone preparing for battle, but without rage. I cooked, I wrote, I walked in the park. I refused to let fear dictate my hours. The hearing date was set for 3 weeks later. Ellen sent no more messages. The silence between us grew vast, a cold and echoing thing, but within it I found a strange strength. I was no longer reacting to her story. I was writing my own. And so, when the summons arrived, I didn't flinch. I placed it carefully in the folder, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat down at the table where this had all begun. The same pale wood, the same quiet room, but the woman sitting there was no longer the one who had once pretended confusion for a discount. I was something else now, someone sharpened by disbelief, tempered by the steady discipline of truth. The escalation was complete, though she didn't yet know it. The next act would not be hers. It would be mine. When the day of the hearing arrived, the city seemed to move with an eerie precision, as though every car, every stranger, every gust of wind had been arranged to test how much resolve I had left. I woke early, before dawn, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the folder open before me like a quiet promise. I reread the words on the neuropsychologist's report. No cognitive impairment, as though repetition could make them talismanic. I buttoned my navy coat, the same one I had worn to my husband's funeral, because it reminded me of endurance, of surviving a ceremony where grief had tried to humiliate me, but failed. I wanted that same quiet defiance now. The courthouse was only 4 blocks away, but it felt like a continent. The marble steps were slick with morning frost, the kind that melts before anyone can prove it existed. Inside, the corridors smelled of paper and disinfectant, the scent of bureaucracy pretending to be justice. I walked slowly, not from weakness, but from intention, forcing myself to notice every detail, the dull glint of fluorescent light on the tiles, the murmur of voices behind closed doors, the echo of my own footsteps that sounded too steady to belong to someone declared unfit. When I reached the courtroom, Ellen was already there, standing beside her lawyer, a young man with too much confidence and not enough wisdom. She turned when she saw me, offering a smile so polished it could have been cut from glass. "You look tired, Mom," she said softly, as though fatigue were proof of guilt. I nodded, not giving her the satisfaction of defense. Her eyes flicked toward my folder. She had expected me to come empty-handed, confused, diminished. Instead, I carried an archive. When the judge entered, everyone stood. He was older than I expected, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, the kind of man who measured truth by the stillness in a person's hands. The proceedings began with formality, her lawyer listing concerns about my well-being, the episodes of forgetfulness, the financial disarray. Each phrase was a weapon sharpened on polite diction. I waited, silent, my pulse steady. When he referred to the article Ellen had arranged to have published, I saw her glance down, ashamed but not enough to stop. They spoke of me as though I were absent, a figure made of rumor and paperwork. And then finally, The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "you may respond." I rose slowly, not for drama, but to feel the weight of standing in my own defense. "Your Honor," I began, my voice lower than I expected, but clear. "My daughter has mistaken control for care and suspicion for love. She has built a story about my fragility because she needs me to be weaker than she is. But I have kept a record, every letter, every visit, every fabricated concern, and I brought it because truth, unlike memory, does not falter." I opened the folder. The pages fanned out across the table like wings. I handed the judge the report from the neuropsychologist, the bank statements, the notarized declarations. "These," I said, "are the pieces of a life managed, not mismanaged." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air vent. Then the judge spoke again, softly. "You've been thorough." It wasn't a compliment. It was acknowledgement. Ellen's lawyer tried to object, muttering about emotional instability, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. He asked me questions, names, dates, financial figures, even the titles of books I had cataloged in my final year at the library. I answered each one, not quickly, but without hesitation. Every response was a small resurrection. When it was Ellen's turn to speak, her voice trembled despite her practiced calm. "I was only trying to protect her," she said. "She forgets things. She isolates herself. She writes everything down," I interrupted, not out of anger but correction. The judge allowed it. Ellen's words began to falter. I saw something flicker across her face. Confusion first, then fear. The story she'd been building for months was crumbling under the simple gravity of evidence. The hearing lasted less than an hour, but time inside that room stretched like taffy, thick and glistening with tension. When the judge finally dismissed the petition, his words were brief but final. "No grounds for conservatorship. Case closed." The gavel struck once, a sound both brutal and liberating. I gathered my papers slowly, carefully, each one a fragment of reclaimed existence. Ellen remained seated, staring down at her hands as if they no longer obeyed her. I wanted to touch her shoulder, to say something merciful, but mercy felt dishonest. She had tried to erase me with the same soft voice she once used to ask for bedtime stories. There are wounds that politeness cannot mend. Outside, the winter light was harsh but clean. The air tasted like metal and renewal. I walked down the courthouse steps, my legs shaking slightly from the adrenaline that follows survival. For the first time in months, I felt tall. Each breath seemed to return something that had been taken: dignity, agency, the right to name myself. I reached the corner where the buses idled and stood for a long time, watching the city move as though it had been waiting for me to rejoin it. A man passed by carrying a newspaper. The headline was about politics, but I caught sight of the smaller subtext. "Local court dismisses conservatorship claim." No names, no photos, but I knew it was mine. My scandal had become a statistic, and I felt oddly grateful. Let anonymity be my refuge. When I reached home, I placed the folder on the table and poured myself a glass of water. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but earned. I looked around, the books, the lamp, the coat draped over the chair, and realized that everything was exactly where I had left it. For months I had lived as though my world were shrinking, but now it felt vast again, full of corners I hadn't explored in years. I thought about Ellen, about how fear had twisted her love into domination, and for a moment I let pity touch me, light as dust. Then I brushed it away. Pity is the last disguise of grief. I opened the window. The air that entered was sharp and bright, carrying the faint scent of rain. Somewhere down the street, a child was laughing, pure, uncalculated sound. I closed my eyes and listened. The sound wasn't redemption, not exactly, but it was enough. That evening, I wrote one final entry in the notebook. I didn't write about victory or justice or forgiveness. I wrote about clarity, the kind that arrives after the storm, when you can finally see the damage and know it's survivable. I wrote, "The truth doesn't save you. It simply refuses to let you disappear." Then I closed the notebook and placed it beside the empty teacup. Outside, the city kept breathing, indifferent but alive, and I breathed with it, steady and unafraid, no longer anyone's story, but my own. After the hearing, the days unfolded like long sighs, the kind that release more than air. The tension that had wound itself into my muscles for months began to loosen, though not all at once. At first, I moved through my apartment cautiously, as if everything inside might still betray me. The kettle, the clock, even the chair where Ellen had once sat and smiled as she lied. But nothing moved except the light, which now entered differently, softer, more patient. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, not even relief, but a kind of recalibration, a slow readjustment to the sound of my own breathing. I kept expecting the phone to ring, expecting another message, another small attempt to reclaim control, yet the silence stretched on. It was a silence I had earned, one that no longer felt like exile, but restoration. One morning, I woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and made tea in the half-dark. The city outside was just beginning to stir, the distant rattle of buses, the sound of someone dragging a garbage bin across pavement, the world resuming its indifferent rhythm. I sat by the window, the cup warming my hands, and opened my notebook for the last time. The pages were thick with evidence and memory, ink pressed into paper like sediment, recording the slow formation of a mountain. I read the entries from the first day, when I still thought documentation would save me. I smiled at my own precision, the meticulous listing of times and dates and witnesses. It wasn't the records themselves that had preserved me. It was the act of writing, of insisting on coherence when others insisted on confusion. Each word had been a declaration that I was still here, still lucid, still sovereign. Later that week, Nora came by. She brought tulips, yellow and stubbornly bright, and placed them in a jar on my table. We didn't talk about Ellen or the hearing. Instead, we spoke of books, of the small library projects she was running, of the way the new students barely knew how to hold silence without a screen to fill it. It felt good to speak of ordinary things again. When she left, she hugged me for a long time and said, "You should write this down, not the facts, the feelings. Otherwise, someone else will do it for you." I told her I already had, though she didn't understand how literal that was. After she left, I walked to the park, the same one where I had sat through the early weeks of fear. The bench was still there, the elm tree still shedding small pieces of bark, the air thick with the smell of wet grass. I sat down and simply existed, no performance, no vigilance. A few days later, I received a letter from Ellen. No lawyer's stamp this time, no official seal, just her handwriting, smaller than I remembered, as though her certainty had shrunk. I waited a full day before opening it. Inside, she apologized, not grandly, not completely, but in that fragmented way people do when they are still half defending themselves. She wrote that she hadn't realized how much she was hurting me, that she had been frightened by how alone I seemed, that she had wanted to protect me before she understood what protection can become. I read it twice. There were no tears, no warmth, only recognition. I placed the letter in the back of the notebook, not as reconciliation, but as evidence that stories can shift, even if only slightly. I didn't write back. Some conversations end more truthfully in silence. In the following weeks, I began to move differently through my days. I cleaned the apartment, gave away old clothes, sorted through photographs. I even called the library and asked if they needed volunteers. The new librarian sounded delighted, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for the ghost of the old system to return. I began going twice a week, helping to catalog donations, guiding children through the logic of the Dewey Decimal System, the small geometry of order that had always comforted me. Sometimes, as I walked through the stacks, I felt a tremor of disbelief that this simple routine had been stolen from me for so long by the fog of suspicion. The world felt navigable again. Every so often, I still thought of that day in the restaurant, the white tablecloth, the candle flicker, the moment Ellen's voice dropped into that conspiratorial whisper. It had seemed so small, so harmless then, yet it had been the seed of an entire unraveling. Now, when I remember it, I see not humiliation, but revelation. The instant the illusion cracked, and I was forced to choose between vanishing politely or reclaiming myself loudly enough that even silence would carry my name. I chose the latter, though I hadn't known it then. I suppose we rarely recognize our turning points while we're inside them. One evening in early summer, Lily came to visit. She stood in the doorway uncertainly, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. She looked older, more tentative. "Mom told me everything," she said. I didn't ask what version of everything she meant. Instead, I made tea, poured 2 cups, and waited. She told me she hadn't known what was happening, that she'd believed what she'd been told, that she wanted to see for herself. We spoke for hours, not about betrayal, but about lineage, about how patterns pass through families like invisible heirlooms. Before she left, she said, "I think I understand you better now." It was the gentlest sentence I'd heard in a long time. After she was gone, I sat by the open window, the air warm and heavy with the scent of rain, and felt something settle in me that wasn't peace, but something close enough to live with. In the end, there was no grand reconciliation, no cinematic forgiveness. Life rarely arranges itself into neat closures. What remained was quieter and more human, a coexistence of memory and will, pain and endurance. I still write, though now it's not in the old notebook, but in a smaller one, pale blue, its pages blank except for the first line I wrote in careful ink. To remember is not to cling, but to know where the ghosts are buried. I keep it by the window. Sometimes, when the light falls just right, it looks almost like an unopened letter. I know people will continue to speak, to invent, to misinterpret. The world is full of stories that mistake survival for bitterness. But I have learned that dignity is not granted. It is performed daily, in the quiet consistency of one's own truth. I no longer fear being forgotten. The ones who erase themselves for comfort are the ones who vanish. I am not one of them. So here I am, 81, drinking tea that has gone lukewarm, watching the city beyond my window as it hums with its endless indifference. I don't need its attention anymore. I write these words only so that somewhere, some woman like me, confused not by age but by the cruelty of those who claim to love her, might know she isn't alone. We are many, scattered across kitchens and small apartments, learning how to live unobserved but undeniable. And when someone whispers to her to pretend, to shrink, to yield, maybe she will remember my voice and say gently but firmly, "No, I remember everything.